Hello, and welcome to this session on soft materials. I'm Virginia Ellen Melnick, and for almost a year now, I have been running many of the events here at Digital Futures behind the scenes. Today, it is my pleasure to have had the opportunity to organize this event and these speakers whose work has inspired me on my own research within textiles and architecture. Today, we have Mette Ramsgaard Thomsen, and her assistant, Yuliya Šinke, Sean Ahlquist, Felecia Davis, Jane Scott, and Jenny Sabin. Each presenter will give a brief presentation of their work, and then we will have a session of discussion and questions afterwards, led by me, and Philip Beasley will hopefully be joining us as well. Before we start the presentations, I wanted to give a brief introduction to the topic of soft materials. My work has engaged temporary structures dealing with textiles and tactile environments. Soft materials behave differently and provide a variety of new opportunities for architectural design. Knit materials specifically have the ability to be programmed and have embedded technologies designed within the fabric down to the individual stitch level. CNC knitting and CNC weaving have advanced the fabrication techniques for these materials, allowing for them to be programmed and design possibilities with integration of mechanisms, sensors, and possible material transformation inspired by biology. Textile patterning can also be thought of as just decorative, but historical theorists like Gottfried Semper wrote extensively on patterns and textiles. And his work also looked at how these influences from history are engaged into our architectural details of today. The elastic properties of textiles have also become an active part of the structural systems within tensegrity and bending active structures, and they can shift and transform the forces and pressures within our designs. Ultimately, soft materials are fuzzy, tactile, and flexible, and our sensory mechanisms respond to their tactility and softness and willingness for the material to conform to our bodies and our environments. With this, I would like to introduce our first presenter, which will be Mette Ramsgaard Thomsen and Yuliya Šinke. Mette is really well known for starting the research group CITA at the Royal Danish Academy. She also works within the intersection of computational design processes, and her research focus is on materials and the relationships between those and digital technologies. Yuliya Šinke specifically is interested in working with innovative material applications for lightweight structures and adaptive architectures. So please welcome Yuliya and Mette.
So, can you see and hear me? Yeah, good. Thank you so much for inviting us. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's so nice to see so many of you again. If we were in a physical space, it would be one of those, if a bomb explodes, then there will be no knowledge on architecture and knit. But I guess it's not a concern in our era. It's very nice to be part of this discussion, and I like your introduction, Virginia, because it's also very much what we were wanting to discuss and show sort of the newest work that we are doing. I am Mette, I'm from CITA, and I wanted to talk a little bit about our textile focus, taking into account our specific interest in bending active structures and textile membranes, and the idea of material specification as a way of being able to tune the performance of the membrane. So I think when you invited me, Virginia, then I was wondering, what do you mean when you say soft? And because there are so many strands, we're doing a lot of interesting work with bacteria right now. They're also very soft and very wet. And so I was interested in that this idea of talking about the soft, which we have also been working with since I think this was published in 2011 or something like that. Or 9 maybe, this idea of working with ideas of softness and understanding material behavior has starting to get new connotations in our own work here. In the way we have sort of strategized our textile work, we look at textiles as following two traditions, idea of the tent and the tapestry, which references the sort of poetic and the decorative and the structural. And where we do sort of, which sort of comes along with the idea of the new tent or the idea of the new curtain as two different sorts of trajectories in thinking about what the meaning content of textiles can be in architecture. And we operate on both sides of this divide. I don't know if it needs to be of a divide, but we operate in both spaces. But what I wanted to talk about today, or we wanted to talk about, was really about the performative textile and that role of material specification, in which textiles act both as model and material for architecture, enabling a probing of what happens when architecture becomes a way of thinking about how to design materials and not just to connect materials or given materials into artifacts. So during the last 15 years, we've been working a lot with knit. I think in 2006, we did our first project, Strange Metabolisms. This is a later project called CITA. And what we've been exploring there is really how to think about the interface between design, CAD, representation, and fabrication in a sort of knit-oriented space. We're working with different kinds of ways of developing interfaces, both by developing sort of string-based code systems, but also color-based systems that connect into the interfaces of the machine knitting systems. And then also to say, well, okay, if we can get this very high order control of the material, where we can really start addressing the material at a micro level, what is the information that we pass into it? In CIFTA, we were looking at connecting it to sensors in a window to then make a site-specific curtain that would sift the light strategically, which led to a sort of curtain pattern or a textile pattern with hundreds of thousands of perforations, all sort of driven by environmental impact, translation of environmental impact. Creating these patterns here. When we worked in the structural membranes in Tower and also in Isopia for Venice in 2017, 18 I think it was, these ideas of pattern making are also part of them. So of course here we are working with these active bent membranes that are correlating the forces between the fiberglass rods that are actively bent and then the textile as a tension system, being able to control them by being able to shape the textile. And then we understand, of course, that knit is exciting, as we all know here. This is a connection of the performances of the fibers and of the patterns. And as we variegate the pattern, then we also variegate the material performance. In these projects, we worked a lot with ideas of being able to simulate membrane performance and connect it to a sort of larger design chain that allowed us to specify the membrane and specify performance directly and then output the knitted surfaces. But in Isopia, this was developed further where we were integrating all the, integrating all the channels and all the detailing, all of that could be done in Tower. Then in Isopia, we also started variegating the patterns to be able to pronounce the actual spatiality of the structure, or articulate that more or less. So this is the structure. It sort of changes its performance. It goes for a canopy, so a vault-like structure, and moves back to another kind of canopy on the back side of the structure. And what you can see is we developed this design to fabrication system, which allows us to understand each membrane individually, but also to calculate. You can see these little red lines here, that we calculate the amount of fiber that actually goes into each of these membranes, and therefore also to be able to variegate its stretchability. So the pattern making on the textile also allows us to sort of allow the noses of the structure to be articulated more or less, and thereby to shape the depth of the actual beam structure that these membranes are making, and therefore their performance. And this has led to the new research that Yuliya is doing in trying to find out how to articulate these patterns more, and to find out how to simulate their performance.
Yes, as Mette mentioned that in Isoropia, you saw in the diagram that we were calculating how we would steer our design idea about the spreading the stars to articulate the protrusions. But we were doing it 2 dimensions. So in my project, I'm trying to see whether we can couple the 3-dimensional representation of fabrics and 2-dimensional fabrication pattern and the physical outcome. So we know that we can articulate the patterns, and we know that we can make a spring simulation of this, but we were not sure whether those things resemble each other in the reality and in the digital world. So I started with the experiment that I will describe now, where I had 9 square samples with different patterns that I designed manually just to test different options. And then I fabricated those, and I wanted to see how actually physical outcome of this pattern would be close to my simulation. And the main question arises is that what kind of stiffness values we would apply to this zone. So you can see here by color, there's different neat patterns are embedded in the pattern. I think next, Mette, you can click. Here's the video, but maybe if you go to the next slide, where's the full diagram? So what I had in my case is that 2-dimensionally designed pattern that was produced on a CNC knitting machine, and then I had the physical object. Back.
Yeah, I think
then I had, in my digital environment, I had 2 sets of meshes. So one is the result of the point cloud scanning of the physical mesh, and then the digital spring-based mesh. So what I did, without going too much in details, is that I calculated the distance, how much we deviate per each design from the physical environment. Mette, can you go back? From the physical sample to the digital sample, and then on this diagram with magenta color, you can see that it's a large deviation. And then on the next step, 0.8, you see that magenta is reducing. So what I did, I ran the Galapagos optimization algorithm, where it would actually run through many thousands of stiffness values per each zone and find the best suiting combinatorics. Of course, it's computationally intense, but in the end, the workflow showed quite a high precision. So in the end, per each design, I could achieve quite precise result, which is close to the point cloud of a scan mesh. Although, in my experience, this method was not very universal, because the stiffness values I received while optimizing every design would not cross applicable across the different designs, which was a very interesting problem. And but what I learned is that there's more aspects need to be taking high attention into, which means the topology of the pattern. So is it more like horizontal, vertical, cross type, or it's more center oriented, or it's more dispersed type of pattern where we have a lot of small zones versus large zones. So it all affects the physical performance of the fabric knitted based on this pattern. And and the next slide, that's another project we try to take alternative paths, as we experience that it's still a bit challenging to make a very highly precise simulation of the graded knit. So we thought, what if we actually have some data that we would load into machine learning algorithms that would actually understand what kind of pattern result in what kind of depth of the cone. So we made this augmentation of the data by chopping the patterns into small pieces of the pattern to get more information in, by flipping, mirroring, and rotating. I think next. So it was quite interesting because some of the patterns were predicted quite precise. As you can see, the middle line is what was manually designed and the bottom line is what the algorithm predicted. Although sometimes for the algorithm it was confusing, as you see that in C and F it gets confusing results. But we explain it by the primitivity of the setup. So we just had a square pattern that always was loaded in the middle as a cone, and you can see that the grayscale first line diagram, which represents the depth through the grayscale tone, it was for completely different pattern types, typologies. It was very similar outcome, so that was actually the problem. But there was some promising actually features, and if you go to the next, yeah, I think this we produced it to compare. So if you go back, you can see that in behind the stripe to the right, there's the sample we wanted to predict. So we left it untrained. So, and below of it, is the pattern that was predicted by the algorithm, and we produced the actual textile piece in order to compare how deep of a depth we would get. Unfortunately, it was a bit off. Although counting the amount of error we had in this experiment is actually maybe could be acceptable if we work with the expandable textiles. So still something more in depth to look. But it took us actually further to see whether digitally we could give a task to our algorithm to look outside of the domain we had. So for example, if we started with one cone, which means one grayscale dot in the middle, and if we would challenge it and say we need a two cone geometry, for example, that we never actually produced, but it's outside of our scope, then it would actually predict the pattern that would have a two pulling points and the geometry around it, like in this light pink and pink, as well it worked out with 3 points.
So the point is that we can connect these ideas of pattern making and material specification to our sort of larger framework around machine learning for fabrication, and that we can start predicting topologies that we have not pre-seen before. Beyond this, I think also a larger question to ask us all is what are the architectural consequences of this kind of material? As you were saying, Virginia, what is the softness? How do we live around it? And what is the identity of the soft space? So in our work, we are particularly interested in this idea of a vault space, bringing forth a sort of textile membrane that has an intimacy that a normal or other membrane architecture doesn't have, but the knit does. And what I think the next steps for us is really to challenge what is the sort of typology of the space that we are producing, and what is the way that we can inhabit the soft space. So that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Really wonderful work, both of you. So our next presenter will be Jane Scott. While Jane sets up her presentation here, I'd like to introduce her by saying that Jane is a design researcher whose practice is located at that interface between programmable textiles, architecture, and biology. She is a specialist in knitted fabric whose recent work has challenged the established understanding of smart materials and architecture, applying principles derived from biology and to the development of environmentally responsive textile systems. She is the leader at Hub for Biotechnology and the Built Environment in Newcastle, and is an academic track fellow. And she is also an interdisciplinary collaborator developing new generation of living textiles for architecture and the built environment. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to participate in this event today. And what I really wanted to do in the presentation was to introduce my research, position my thinking around soft materials in architecture, really to consider the notion of scale, and in particular how we can use scale in textiles, specifically knitted fabric, on the interface between buildings, living systems and the environment. So my research focuses on the design of living textiles. And in thinking about the living, this represents firstly design informed by biomimicry, so essentially learning from the living. Secondly, thinking about textiles that are engineered to support and sustain biological processes, so working with the living. And then finally, thinking about applications, thinking about fabrics that operate at the scale of the building, and so kind of with the living. So very briefly, my background, I trained as a textile designer and a knit specialist, and I joined Newcastle University just last year in 2020 to take up a fellowship there. So previously I worked at the University of Leeds, and I also completed my PhD at Central St Martin's in the Material Futures group. So scale for me begins with an interest in how knitted fabric behaves at different scales for different site-specific environments, and can be transformed through textile interventions. So this slide just shows a series of large-scale interventions where we were challenging the materiality of knitting through scale and location. And I think in each of these examples, it's a relationship between the fabric and the yarns and the site itself that produces these unique forms and experiences of knitting. So alongside this, I'm also really interested in using scale to challenge the notion of smart textiles for architecture. And the piece Dynamic Textiles in the bottom corner really was kind of a catalyst to start thinking about activating knitted fabric to produce soft materials as a dynamic interface for the built environment. Started with kind of electronic systems and using motors. What I was really keen to do was to try and engineer the behavior into the fabric itself. And so that kind of brought me into my first theme, which is the idea of thinking and modeling knit and nature. So as I said, it started as a journey into smart textiles, but I realized I'm much more interested in being able to engineer behavior into the fabric as a function of a knitted fabric. And so I began working with biomimicry methodologies to try and understand how sense and response systems worked in nature, and then to try and apply that back to textiles. And all the biomimetic models I've worked with so far have been from plant systems. I'm particularly interested in how plants adapt to their environment, how they respond to light, space, water, and nutrients in the way they grow. And I think for a textile designer, plants are actually an excellent model to look at. Both plant tissue and textiles are composed of fibers. In both plants and textiles, you get these multiple levels of organization and hierarchy in the formation of the material system. And the biomimetic model I started with was which has been used a lot to kind of inform experimental architectures, to develop like bi-layer systems, actuated systems. So thinking about how the differential expansion in the material that you observe in the pinecone scale can then be transformed into an actuator for different material systems. And what I wanted to do was to apply this to knitted fabric. So this is a system that I developed called Programmable knitting. And it really comes directly from analysis of pine cones and thinking about the hierarchies how the hierarchies work across different scales. And what it enabled me to do was to develop a moisture responsive system for knitted fabric. And so fundamentally, there's kind of 4 levels to this hierarchy, or to this system. So you start with the fibers, and it's fundamentally about how fibers respond to moisture. And obviously different fibers respond in different ways. And you can kind of tune a fabric depending on the fiber you choose. At the second level of the hierarchy, it's about thinking about the yarns and spinning parameters and how you can use those to, again, engineer behavior. And then working up the hierarchy, thinking about how you can use fibers and yarns to program fabric. And obviously the really exciting thing about knit is that it's a continuous material. So once you've programmed structures within the fabric, what you can get is a really amazing overall behavior change in fabric. So just to show you a little clip of how the fabrics actuate, this fabric is 100% European linen, so no chemical treatments, and the actuation is just driven by the structure of the material itself, so transferring this idea of the knowledge of plant structure into textile design. But I guess for me, the point isn't that you can make a fabric move, it's that you can program specific movements into fabrics. And so this slide just shows a range of different programmed that I've developed for knitted fabrics. So on the left-hand side, there's a series of assemblies. So they combine wood veneer and knitted fabric to produce three-dimensional shape change that's moisture responsive. And here the bilayer, so the wood veneer itself is actuating the material, but the knit provides the overall topology, the geometry of the structure. And on the right-hand side, it's a series of knitted fabrics that are 100% natural fibers. Again, these are moisture sensitive, so they respond to either moisture in the environment, or you can actuate them with a water spray as well. And you can achieve a range of 2D to 3D shape change behaviors. And so what I think is really interesting about it is that you can engineer this into the material, the textile itself. And what I'm doing in the next process of my work is really trying to extend this work through working with living materials. So the first project I just wanted to show briefly was this idea of textiles and living materials. So on screen, you can see mycelium knit biocomposites using mycelium, which is the root system of fungus, to transform a knitted fabric. And what I've been doing is working to try and produce composites with both functional and responsive properties as well. So on one level, I'm really interested in exploring how knitted fabrics can offer a bespoke scaffold for biological materials to produce these biocomposites. And in this program of work, I'm collaborating with a microbial ecologist, Angela Sherry, who also works at the Hub for Biotechnology in the Built Environment with me. And we're really thinking about how we can use this knowledge to design both positive and healthy microbial communities for the built environment using textiles, so they're both functioning and functional microbial textile systems. So here we're looking at the interaction between mycelium, bacteria, and textiles using growth experiments and visualization technologies. And through this initial work, we've developed fiber highways, which is a collection of environmentally responsive textiles that unite knit design with microbial ecology. And this one's actually requires specific application. So we're really here looking at the challenge of hydrocarbon remediation, and we're looking at whether we can develop experimental textile systems, kind of multi-kingdom systems that allows to provide an environment for bacteria and mycelium to cohabit and really, yeah, so that textiles can empower these communities of microorganisms, firstly to cleanse polluted environments, for the example of hydrocarbon remediation, but also alongside that, how microorganisms can actually transform knitted fabric properties to enhance that remediation. So what's been really interesting for me is obviously this has taken my work from the studio into the lab, which has been really interesting to identify kind of how these interactions are happening and looking at a lot of really interesting images and film under microscopes, which has been great for me. But then we're trying to take that that knowledge back into the textile scale to think about how we can use it. And so we're looking at things like at the micro scale, we're looking at fiber morphology and how that's informed the design, fabric design for microbial habitation. And then at a macro scale, we're looking at things like variable liquid densities. So how can we design for different kinds of liquid, and how can we program our fabrics to give a different response dependent on the liquid that we're trying to kind of engage with and interact with. And so we're using the programmable textile system to kind of produce these interactive, responsive materials. So taking it back to architecture, I guess that body of work has really opened up a lot of really interesting questions for us about what we could do if we then scaled up, and what could a bionic composite architecture actually offer. And we're really interested in considering a number of ideas around that, really related to knit design. So thinking about the idea of a scaffold for growth and how that could be particularly focused on knitting. What kind of bespoke forms we can achieve through knit. And I think this afternoon we'll see an amazing array of those kind of forms, and also the scalability. And I think that for me is what knit in particular, textiles in general and knit in particular, really offer this idea of soft materials for architecture. And I guess these are the ways I really see the work developing. So underpinning it all, there's a functional potential of textiles. So textiles as a material system has this incredible hierarchy, starting with the fibre itself. So starting with that fibre morphology, thinking about how you can design using specific fibres and transforming behaviours by transforming the fibres that you're using. At the next level, the yarn, combining yarns and pulling back to that simplicity of using one yarn structure within a fabric. And then at the higher level of the hierarchy, obviously the fabric structure gives you this amazing potential to design both 2D, 3D, kind of this extensive amount of forms. But then alongside that, and I think what was really highlighted in the last presentation, is that knit has this incredible technology to support this. So it's not only a textile making process, but actually we have this incredible software and manufacturing capability to transform these fabrics into really sophisticated architectures. And for me, I think the parameters that really interest me for living textiles is how you can extend that from the fibre all the way down, thinking about the fibres, yarn, fabric, the form, and then also the finishing processes. So how can we really think about transforming the properties of fabrics across that hierarchy, across that scale divide? And finally, I just wanted to share kind of the new project that we're developing in the hub on site at the moment. So it is an experimental living building called the OHM, which, as I say, it's on site, it's being developed at the moment, and it's just going to be a fantastic resource for us. So within the hub, it's a lot more than my work, and I'm certainly not the leader of the hub. I'm one of the research fellows within it. And whereas my work obviously looks at textiles, there's all sorts of specialist research going on within the hub, specifically focused on biotech for the built environment. And in order to test these kind of experimental technologies that are being developed, we're actually having this experimental building constructed on site. And really the idea is it's a building within a building. So we can, there'll be a self-contained apartment inside, and essentially all the materials and systems can be tested within a protective building envelope. So it really gives us this freedom to experiment with materials and processes that aren't quite ready for external exposure, but need that live testing in a building environment. So for me, I'm really interested in the potential to explore how we can manipulate the building's microbiome through modifying surfaces and ventilation systems. And then there'll be opportunities to engage with all the different kind of building systems as well within that. And so the really exciting thing for me is that this year we're developing a full-scale bionic composite for the OHM later in 2021. And what we're really aiming to try and do with the prototype is express all those textile qualities, so all those qualities of knitted fabric, but supported through biomaterials and at the scale of the building. So watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Jane. Really appreciate it. Amazing work, absolutely. So moving right along, next we will have Felecia Davis, I will introduce Felecia while she gets her screen up and running. But Felecia is a computational textile designer who reimagines how we might use textiles in our daily lives and within architecture. She has integrated smart elements such as sensors and receptors into her materials so that she can engage humans and interact with them. She is interested in developing computational methods in relation to design specific bodies and specific places, engaging specific social and cultural political constructs. She is an associate professor at the Stuckman Center for Design Computing in the School of Architecture at Penn State University and director of Soft Lab PSU. She completed her PhD in design computation at MIT, and her work engages art, science, and engineering. Currently, she has her work exhibited at MoMA in the Reconstruction, Blackness, and Architecture in America. And she is also a founding member of Black Reconstruction Collective, a not-for-profit group of Black architects, scholars, and artists supporting design work about the Black diaspora. Welcome, Felecia.
Thank you, Virginia. Can everyone see my screen without the presenter notes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, it's always fun to have happen. Thank you so much for this opportunity and invitation to have this conversation with these amazing folks. So I'm really looking forward to today. So in this slide presentation, I'd like to share with you a capsule of some ideas that are part of the work that was done for the Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, which, as Virginia mentioned, is on exhibit until the 31st of May in New York. I would like to show you some of the entanglements, so to speak, of working with textiles, computation, and soft materials. I find that the material itself shapes a way of thinking and working that I think leads to considering architecture and its practices in a different way. So I would say that my lab has been working towards understanding a soft system, which is thus far to us a system that accounts for and accommodates a technological series of methods that can register design in relationship to specific bodies in particular places and their kind of social construction. I don't think we have that kind of quest like where we want it to be yet, but we are striving and we're looking for how to get there. And so I would love to have this discussion to push that further along. In my lab, Soft Lab at Penn State in the Stuckman Center for Design Computing, we work on computational textiles, which are textiles that respond to their environment via programming, embedded sensors, and electronics. In addition, we look at the responses from the natural properties of fibers, where the response is used by the designer to communicate some type of information. So communication for our purposes means the sending of an intentional message or information through an aesthetic expression. So our work in the lab is really to relook at the role of textiles in building, not just as a way to achieve lightweight buildings, but to understand how we can use the fibers of the textile itself to communicate and how that impacts the larger architecture. So I'd like to have a look at what I mean by computational textiles as a material. If you really start to think about it, computational textiles change the idea of material. Material may be seen like in the above image, where a designer is weaving together a person, a body monitor, such as a heart monitor, a mobile phone, a laptop, a set of responsive yarns, a power system, and the larger environment. So this particular drawing shows one example of a material textile system, but there may be other systems that include other parts, such as a person who may be looking at what's happening to the heart monitor, or a manufacturer who may be connected with a wearer. So to our eyes, a smart material or materials have really included bodies that is done in a way that's very expansive. So if one could look at this, one might ask, thinking back to Semper, what style of material do we have here? What kind of skills, tools, resources are needed here to create such materials? And how should we classify them? If materials change us as we change them, as Tim Ingold and J.J. Gibson's and many others argue, how are these materials changing our bodies and our way of thinking? And maybe we can return to some of these questions later in our discussion. So the work of the studio that was done for the show at MoMA is titled Fabricating Networks, Transmissions and Receptions from the Hill District. And it used computational textiles, which look at the idea of networking or connecting with people. In this case, connecting with the residents of a historically Black neighborhood in Pittsburgh. It was that social and emotional connection that was of most concern to us, and the means by which that could happen. Unfortunately, COVID intervened and stopped our in-person quilting sessions, but we're looking forward to working on telling the story of the Hill District and residents when things start to open back up. But there are two parts to this work, transmissions and receptions. The transmissions part connects the stories of the Hill District in Pittsburgh. The quilt points to those experiences and skills with sewing, working with soft materials, and brings them into architecture as real material, as metaphor, or as heuristic device for thinking about operations and concepts in making and architecture. The quilt operates as a way to start a conversation about making and as a repository of history. When touched, the copper in each panel activates a speaker that tells a story of what happened in that panel. And as I said, we plan on taking this quilt on the road to the Hill District to hear other stories. So here, the softness in this material system is how we define the concept of construction of communication, which is collaborative and incrementally built. The lily pad, which you see in the bottom of the picture, is designed by Leah Beakley, a designer and computer scientist at the University of New Mexico, and it permits the fashioning of do-it-yourself work. This is supported by a network of online tutorials and programs. This network is also part of what we understand to be the material. For many of the works we do, the ability to access and use these inexpensive do-it-yourself components is what the difference is between soft and hard, a soft boundary and a hard boundary. So here's a detail of that quilt showing a scene that speaks to how I set up my lab at Penn State. The lab at Penn State is a way of foregrounding the making experiences that many of us had as kids and still have working with soft materials. These materials call for another way of fabrication and thinking about architecture that connects both the scale of the body, because we often start by making things like clothing and then move up to very large scales of architecture. Working this way also returns you to the specifics of your body, not some abstract body that you're building for, but a particular body. And for this direction, there are two research kind of prongs, or I guess you could say areas in the lab. The first direction is more architecturally traditional, where we look at using textiles for sheltering. These are projects like tents, shade structures, etc. A second direction is looking at the human body in space and trying to understand the potentials for rethinking what architecture could be by understanding the augmented and sensing body in its environment. These projects are materials that you wear on your body or use the body as part of its system. A scene like you see in this quilt panel was a very familiar scene to me growing up. And I feel and still feel that many of the things that I've been thinking about came from this well of knowledge about soft materials. So the reception part of the project that's at MoMA is what we call the flower antenna, and is located in the museum. It's not on the road traveling, it's an installation. It's a symbolically responsive structure, a receiving antenna. 34 knitted, industrially knitted cones are embedded with pink copper yarns that transmit the presence of electromagnetic waves via high-pitched live sounds in the gallery. This black flower serves to make visible and present the workings of an invisible urbanism that floats above the physical city, supported and constructed by electromagnetic waves. These invisible waves are a new global ocean, making it possible for people to connect through the internet. However, traversing this ocean in our everyday practices is as perilous as the Atlantic or Middle Passage. The black flower is a reminder of this other invisible space that's also being constructed and needs attention for more life-valuing future. So the underbelly of the antenna shows pink copper embedded yarns, which is what permits the collection of the invisible electromagnetic waves in the gallery. This form of the flower was selected to give us the opportunity to study a gradient of parametrically sized cones. These were drawn in Kangaroo and Kiwi 3D, simulated to see if we could predict the sizes and shapes of the cones. So very much like Mette's practice and Yuliya's practice, we are involved as architects in trying to predict what we draw from the digital representation and getting it into a fabricated piece. Because as you know, with textiles, what you start off with is often very different from what you end up with in terms of drawing to fabrication. So this was important to help with getting the fiberglass compression rods the right length and the right diameters. We also tested a couple different of machine learning methods and have looked at Mette's and Yuliya's methods on this using scanning as well as a couple of other methods. And we're publishing part of this research, who is being done by Farzana Aghazian, a PhD student in the Soft Lab, titled A Simulation Process for Architectural Knitted Textiles at IAAS. So more on this will be published and you should look for that to follow up on that. So underneath, we're looking at this pink copper yarn, which was really a big help in terms of helping us predict and stabilize, predict the position and stabilize the cotton yarn that we were using. So not only were we trying to predict from the drawing, but also trying to understand the qualities of yarns and how that affected this issue of kind of getting from the drawing to the actual material. Oops, oh dear. Sorry about that. So this just gives you an idea of some of the scale of these cones. They were quite large. We were trying to really get our work from smaller sample pieces to larger pieces that we could begin to imagine people being within and circulating around. So to wrap things up, about our lab. What we're really trying to do in developing these computational methods, tools, and designs for soft architectures is connect with people emotionally, to register their presence, to provoke questions about the order of our society. We view softness as a powerful quality to think about reconstructing. And so with that, I will conclude and look forward to the other presentations in our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Amazing work, Felecia. I absolutely love it. And it really gets to that point of just what is softness and how do us as humans relate to it. Next, we will have Jenny Sabin. While Jenny gets her presentation up on the share screen here, I'll give her a brief introduction. Jenny was actually my professor at UPenn many years ago when I was a young first-year student, the grad program. She is an architectural designer whose practice is one that investigates the intersection of architecture, science, and applies insights and theories from biology, mathematics, to the design of material structures. She is the Arthur L. and Isabel B. Wisner Professor in Architecture and the Associate Dean for Design at Cornell University of Architecture in Ithaca, New York. And she is also lead of the Jenny Sabin Studio and the Sabin Lab at Cornell. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Can everyone see my screen, full screen?
Yes.
Great, fantastic. It's really a sincere pleasure to be joining all of you today to discuss the topic of softness. To join a group of people that I just absolutely love and adore, and whose work I deeply respect and admire. So it's really a sincere pleasure to be here, and also to come full circle, Virginia. Thank you so much for organizing this panel. So what is softness? Softness for us is biosynthetic. Through the lens of my collaborative work, we pursue biosynthetic architecture, where architecture as analog produces unfolding hybrid multiplicities that are transdisciplinary and trans-individual. I've found analogs for this underlying substrate in weaving, knitting, technology, and biology as they connect to processes of generative design across disciplinary boundaries. Biosynthetic architecture searches for adaptive solutions through the intricate symbiosis of technology, biology, and design. With strong links to my lab at Cornell AAP, the driving mission behind my practice and research is to create resilient, science-driven, and transformative spaces with and for diverse communities. We frequently start with very simple parts and rules that through feedback and iteration produce much more complex spatial wholes. This interest importantly also probes the productive tinkering and misuse of fabrication machines, oftentimes found in alternate industries such as in robotics and the automotive industry, and certainly within textiles. These interests are also informed by issues of craft and making to produce bio-inspired material systems and software design tools that have the capacity to facilitate embedded expressions in our built environments. We purposefully resist the post-rationalization of complex form through an approach that engages a materially directed generative design process, or what I call matter design computation. And this has impacts and applications, importantly, in both science, architecture, and engineering. So one of the fundamental questions that we ask is, how might buildings and their integrated material assemblies behave more like organisms as an analog, responding to and adapting to their built environments? A seminal reference for my work is the biological extracellular matrix, which is a dynamic protein network that physically and chemically couples the exterior environment of cells with their interior and vice versa. And this is the work of longtime collaborator, Dr. Peter Lloyd-Jones. We co-founded Lab Studio in 2005 when I was teaching at Penn many years ago now. Drawing on historian Detlef Mertens' description of his term bioconstructivisms, the emphasis is upon the analogic negotiation of, quote, morphological behavior as a dynamic substrate that is then filtered through material organizations. That is, the pursuit is to form a biosynthesis of a natural model with material manifestation. The architectural results of such an environment, to use Mertens' words, are, quote, self-different, in which identity is hybrid, multiple, and importantly, open-ended. So I'd like to touch upon just two projects very briefly, starting with the following questions. How might we design and enhance architecture with the bioarchitecture and behavior of our own bodies and local environments? Can building materials be made more responsive through the integration of artificial intelligence and big data? Lumen for MoMA and MoMA PS1, which was part of my winning entry for the Young Architects program in 2017. And you can see here to successfully pull a project off for YAP, it takes an army of incredible colleagues and collaborators and students to pull it off. The success of Lumen really hinges on multiple years of interventions and the development of projects that commenced in 2012 with a commission from Nike. They were about to launch a new technology at the time, which is the Flynet technology, which should be very familiar to all of you. And they developed what they called the Flynet Collective, and they invited 6 artists, designers, and architects from around the world to respond and hopefully be inspired by the core benefits of Flynet, and to importantly bring that back into our own fields. And those benefits included form-fitting, lightweight, sustainability, and so on. And so I was interested in working with knitting processes, physically and materially, and also to have the coordination of the final pavilion structure to be driven by a whole series of bio data sets that were collected through a series of workshops. And so this was the first time that I began to collaborate with Šinke. They are a manufacturer of knitting machines. All of you are, I'm sure, quite familiar with them, and experts within what they call whole garment technology, which is seamless CNC machine digital knitting. This was also the first time that I began to leverage our interests in designing directly and dynamically with light and energy through the incorporation of high-tech responsive fibers, namely photoluminescent fibers and solar active fibers. The MyThread Pavilion was the result of 30 bio data sets that ultimately materialized not as a representation, but as a series of coordinated material applications from part to whole to the final assembled surface structure. The Polythread project for the Cooper Hewitt Museum as part of their 5th design triennial titled Beauty was also an important step in this work, where I was interested in developing a reciprocity between the surface architecture, the soft surface architecture, and the exterior active bending structure, where the two would be integrated and work reciprocally in terms of their structure. So you can see here some of those details. And it was also the first time that we began to develop 2 surfaces working together in a coordinated fashion, where In this detail, you can see the whole garment knitted cones operating structurally as springs and negotiating both a soft interior surface and an exterior surface that meets the active bending structure at the edge. And so with Lumen, we built upon, at that point, about 8 years of inquiry into digital knitting processes across various speculative pavilion applications. And I was very interested in how this project could operate as an environment. And I felt confident at the time that the material system that we had been developing was really ready to be applied at an altogether different scale, and also to work directly with the elements. For me, the most important part of the project and its success was seeing people take ownership of it, to develop kind of sense of agency in their environment, and also the conversations that I had with many of the people that visited were quite interesting in the ways that they talked about how they felt within the space. They made mention of how they wished that this project was in their child's playground, how they wished that it was in their local school, how they wished that it was in their local hospital. And so there's something to this type of application in terms of the borderless conditions that soft fibrous structures provide that has resonance with our own bodies. This is a photograph of the large courtyard at night, where you can see the photoluminescent fibers responding and glowing. Importantly, the project made use of the local context, stitching into the existing matrix of concrete walls. There was an embedded sensor network that integrated with a misting system. This is a view from above of the misting corridor. And that included a series of solenoid valves that would respond to a network of IR sensors. And the end result was this kind of sense of a breathing and sort of hissing. And it was actually quite functional in cooling down the local environment beneath the canopies during the hot summer in 2017 in Long Island City. The 42-foot tall tensegrity towers added kind of third envelope of equilibrium to the project. The entire project was designed and built to be highly dynamic. And so these tensegrity towers, you can see here, are strategically located at 3 points within the canopy to lift it at its center points, but again, also to consider how tensegrity as an active material system would be integrated with the large canopy structures. So in this case, biosynthetic architecture is not a metaphor, it is an analog of deeper connections, a trans-individual and transdisciplinary architecture that is steered by the systemic and relational conditions of life. From cell to sentiment, as an undulating network of parts and their informed wholes, a datascape of human embeddedness. And then lastly, just to conclude, a more recent project, Ada for Microsoft Research, which was a part of an artist and designer in residence program that I took part in between 2018 and 2019. Working with researchers and engineers at Microsoft Research, Ada is driven by individual and collective sentiment data collected and housed within Microsoft Research Building 99, on their Redmond campus in Washington State. A network of sensors and cameras located throughout the building offer multiple opportunities for visitors and participants to engage, interact with, and drive the project. The data include facial patterns, voice tones, and so on that are processed by AI algorithms and correlated with sentiment. And this is a view of the interior camera, which can override the entire network of cameras within the building. An important aim of the project was to expand and inspire human engagement, while artificial intelligence powers the project through the precise narrowing and statistical averaging of data collected from individual and collective facial patterns and voice tones. The architecture of Ada augments emotion through aesthetic experience, thereby opening the range of possible human emotional engagement. In turn, the project opens new pathways for fundamental research on the use of AI to correlate connections between human sentiment and local environment, to also probe the ethical questions around the use of AI in terms of privacy. And lastly, Ada will be used as a platform for researchers to test their data and machine learning algorithms at Microsoft Research. So unlike the pioneering work of Mark Sager, such as his BabyX project that seeks to humanize AI through, quote, more symbiotic relationships between humans and machines, Ada does not appear lifelike. Instead, Ada offers subtle and abstract interactions with humans through space, knitted material, and form to augment and expand our emotional range in a specific context, in this case, an office environment, which in turn affects the probable sentiment data being collected as new information. The spaces and environments that we inhabit influence and partially shape who we are and how we are feeling. And through the integration of responsive knitted materials and emerging technologies, Ada offers an interface for personalizing architecture to make it more human and reflexive. And at the same time, the project seeks to expand human emotional engagement through beauty and materiality. Ada has the capacity to promote and hopefully increase well-being through the direct engagement with the architecture that we inhabit and encounter. And with that, I will conclude. These are a few of the amazing people that I have worked with in the past and currently work with. And you can find more information about our work here within these websites. And we've been very fortunate to receive funding from incredible partners in industry, as well as the NSF over the years. Thanks so much.
Amazing work, Jenny. Thank you again for presenting all of that. And I see so many overlaps between all the presenters so far today. And Sean, I'm so sorry that you have to follow all of those great presentations up as our last presenter today, but we are so happy to have you. And while you get your screen sharing set up, I'd just like to introduce you to our audience. Sean Ahlquist is a professor of architecture at the University of Michigan Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. He directs the Lab for Socio-material Architectures, conducting collaborative research and ranges from structural engineering to health science. This research is born to the personal experiences with his autistic daughter, as Sean addresses architecture's pressing need to examine its own culpability towards creating exclusionary spaces. The research and teaching seeks to reorient the effort of design towards facilitating adaptability of environments to the spectrum of diverse forms of physical, cognitive, and behavioral and creative abilities. He also will have an installation at the Venice Biennale this summer. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. It's certainly great to see everybody's work, and just to make a particular note, I think it actually may have been very close to 10 years ago when Mette organized a workshop on knitting in Kolding, Denmark, which was my first view at ever seeing one of these machines. And it just so happened that Felecia was a participant in that workshop as well. So it's kind of exciting to see. Feels like 10 years ago is a long way, but it also seems like there's been amazing progress within what you could also consider a short period of time in using this technology and the diversity of work that's happened. So thank you very much for being having me as a part of this. It's exciting to share the direction that I've been able to take this work in. So obviously a lot has been talked already about knitting, so I'll actually try and stay away from the details of that and really talk a little bit more about kind of the next steps of trying to understand really the potential of these soft environments, if we want to talk about that. And I think Mette mentioning that there's a lot of other soft materials other than just textiles, that certainly plays into, you know, my understanding and experiences with my daughter and her, you know, kind of definition of what soft environment would mean, which actually I think it tells a lot. And one, thinking of soft as being conceptual as well. So that, you know, materiality is malleable in the environments that really address her best and are functional for her. They really are malleable environments, both physically, conceptually, and functionally. You know, ideas that where she is creative and turns a suitcase into actually what ends up being a tool for communication. For anybody interested in kind of digging into the life of experiences and working with having a child with autism, particularly like my daughter, one that's nonverbal. There's a great short film by Pixar, unfortunately only available on Disney Plus, called Loop. And it very much talks about how environment and behavior, all these things are very inextricable, and communication. If you have a chance to watch it, there's a very interesting moment about what the word poop means. And it's really quite enlightening when you find out what poop means. So for my work, it's really about trying to understand architecture. Is it able to be this kind of nexus, happen at this intersection of, you know, intense material research and understanding of neurodiversity and the different ways in which people experience the world and want to interact with it. And then, of course, human behavior, you know, not just individual behavior, but social behavior and how that is all entangled together. So, of course, I have the chance to do this, you know, through the knitting work, and then also through the personal experiences with my daughter. But it is also intensely, really sometimes tiringly interdisciplinary, working with, you know, some of the educators that work with my daughter, but also, you know, in academia, working with psychiatrists, with kinesiologists, understanding how movement, communication, social interaction, all of these things are just completely inextricable from each other, and how architecture can play an active role in that and not a passive role. So, you know, I'll quickly kind of scan through some of the work, but I actually want to show some very, very recent, a very, very recent project with some students that we're doing. So, of course, you know, my fascination is with architecture and the potential that, you know, knitting has this ability to create these seamless, complex, you know, abstract but detailed, really this kind of this ability to work from the finest grain of material and design it exactly to these very, you know, explicit kind of explorational type environments. But what's become more interesting is really, you know, almost kind of seeing that previous image as being a bit boring, I would say. And it's really this moment where the body transforms it, where a child or an adult or an individual, it turns into their canvas for expression. And when they start to find the moments that become most engaging to them, it then turns into communication. It then turns into communication of a multi-sensory environment and the details which are particularly fascinating to an individual or as a part of a social experience. So being able to create through specificity this actually kind of diversity of capacity for ways in which an environment can be occupied, I really think it's exciting to kind of explore that capacity, to kind of let loose from, you know, the kind of staid image of this is this perfectly formed architecture that took so long materially to figure out, actually see, you know, how people can disturb it. And in what ways, and the meaning that arises from that. So, you know, just the additional layer in trying to activate that motion and that interaction is just kind of one detail we found, that like having the visual actually really became a valuable entry point for people to understand this is a tactile environment to physically explore. as opposed to just an architectural object that you walk around or passively sit underneath. So it's an interesting kind of transition once we open that up to see how people engage it in a very delicate manner, but then quickly understand, oh, I touch it, it has an immediate response, and wow, when I touch it, there's a sensation here, there's a different sensation over there. And then actually the visual becomes more passive, more background, and it's much more about the physical, the tactile, the touch of the hand, the feel of the body, the movement within these textiles. So it's interesting to see how it's not just one sensorial motivation, but it actually you know, kind of mutates and changes and evolves just within one experience for a child. And then the other thing to think just about environment as an example, obviously we have to hold these textiles in place, and a lot of people have talked about these bending active systems. So, you know, we had to develop a system that we could easily deploy, but still structure these textile knits in a way that kids could, you know, climb into them in ways that we didn't quite imagine. So it has had quite a degree of robustness. But what becomes really exciting is, of course, all that like technical concern, it obviously has no meaning to the child that actually goes into it. So it just becomes another factor of physical, you know, proprioceptive, vestibular, tactile engagement. You know, this child finding, you know, these brackets and these beams as something to help pull himself into this textile enclosure. So that flipping, that malleability of function, I think is, or diversity of function is really exciting to see and opens up new territory. And of course, you know, with my daughter, finding all sorts of layers of tactility, literally to the depth of like feeling a stitch at the compression of the face. And just to really kind of explain the synthesis of all of this, this is actually a video that, you know, some have probably seen before. It was really from one of our first prototypes, but it's actually helped reveal over the years a lot of things that we were trying to accomplish, but just didn't have the kind of brain power to understand what was actually happening. So this was the first experience for my daughter. Her name is Ada, by the way, A-R-A. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. We pronounce it Ada. So her first experience with this, you know, this was her idea to do this nosedive through the structure. So, you know, I gave her the autonomy to kind of like understand the space, and she found the moment that she wanted to occupy it and experience it. But really the key thing, the key turning point was, if she wants to do that again, it now becomes completely social. I am now intertwined with this sensorial action of sliding through this environment. She knows I am registered as being an integral part of that experience. So the idea that the environment can actually be the trigger, the active trigger, to help reinforce my social bond with her and help us form, you know, a sense of communication, like, okay, you know, walking towards me and giving me a hug, that means pick me up and drop me through and do this nosedive again. So that kind of like synthesis and how architecture was really a critical moment to be able to help me form a relationship, help me form lines of communication with my nonverbal daughter. You know, this was really kind of, it's just an eye-opening as this kind of reveals this through time. So, and then, yeah, mentioning just kind of, this is the some images for the Venice Biennale, and just wanting to say how this is now kind of pushing us to explore materiality further, because obviously we're going to more of a public and exterior landscape where things like projections aren't actually going to work. So looking at materiality as an analog for animation, as an analog for, you know, expanding a sense of tactility, how the, you know, surfaces and materials and visuals can help create different experiences within essentially a kind of static environment. So what I really want to talk about now, and I'm actually going to read from a paper, a short paper that is getting published in the Acadia publication, which I think is soon to come out. This is a project done with 3 people. We're literally right at the end of the semester now, finishing up this project. So it's documentation over the past week. It's done by 2 Michigan students, CC Chen and Motong Liu, and also collaborating with someone, his name is Will Purvis. He is works at the Center for Independent Living here in Ann Arbor, where they provide services for education, for employment, activities, art activities, physical activities, adaptive sports equipment. So it's a quite exciting facility and group to work with. And we basically staged it that somebody from the center would work alongside 2 students to just develop lines of communication, get to know each other, understand disability theory, terminology, lots of different layers, and then develop a project that could speak towards that. And I think this project really talked about it in quite exciting ways. So what I think is interesting here is this kind of proves my point of like, I think this is the least exciting moment of the project, sort of a knit draped into a chair. Maybe a few years ago, I thought that would be kind of cool, but as you'll see in a second, this is kind of the sort of boringness that can happen when you think about the human body becoming a primary actor. So I'm just going to flip through these images and kind of read through this script. So to be blunt, I do feel that architecture so often really gets it wrong. There's a fixedness that arises through our authorship of process and its resulting forms, our celebration of the machines that dictate materiality, and the preconceived narratives for social and environmental responsiveness. Computational design tends to only exacerbate these traits, and it all really accumulates into an architecture of intolerance, where demarcations are drawn between author and inhabitant. The expected, the intended, and what becomes the norm is only revealed by a discomfort with the unexpected, the body, the mind, and the social being that is non-conforming. Quoting from Tobin Sievers, the social body is the standard, presupposed to but invisible, until a non-standard body makes an appearance. Then the standard becomes immediately apparent as the inflexible structures reveal their intolerance for anyone unlike the people for whom they were built. But maybe wrong is okay. To admit to not knowing and guessing wrong shows respect and avoids a false empathy for not trying to walk a mile in someone's shoes. If fixity can be repositioned as an iteration, then wrong can be tolerated as a momentary error. Yet such is only possible if the author is willing, if design process is capable, and if mechanisms within materiality allow for such reiteration. Patience then becomes an architectural trait that is party to a collective search for eventual correction. It is a capacity that both requires and reveals authorship emanating from an unknown and unexpected voice. And it's a voice that will sit outside and likely in opposition to the inscrutable black boxes of our conventional computational processes. To yield, to offer complete submission to the other, to understand the otherness while suspending the self, can architecture do that? Germinating from my personal experiences with my daughter, Ada, and interrogated through interdisciplinary collaborations, the fundamental hypothesis of this research seeks to test architecture's capacity to seed multimodal communication for otherly indefinable social voices. Within our discipline and stemming from our current cultural climate, the tilted architectural viewpoints of the very few are being more acutely scrutinized for their exacerbation of social inequities. Personally, I see and experience prejudice in the moments where architecture sits in opposition to my daughter's worldview, one that she constructs through her autism and her novel and incredible forms and creative forms of nonverbal communication. Professionally, this shapes the fundamental inquiry of this research. What computational paradigms faculties, facilities, techniques constitute an architecture in constant transformation, being ceaselessly reauthored by n number of agents and becoming communication for something rightfully unknown. If we talk about environmental sensitivity, we can look at research through trial development by W. Thomas Boyce. It provides nuance to the term adaptability or assimilation. The dandelion, the quote dandelion, is imbued with the ability to assimilate in all but the worst of circumstances. Alternatively, the highly reactive individual is characterized as the orchid, heavily burdened in discordant conditions with their environment, yet capable of exceptional outcomes, even better than the largely resilient dandelion, in circumstances where environment is aligned with their sensorial inclinations. This defines the central paradox driving the research, resolving architecture's demand for material precision versus diversity's demand for patience, to let agency generate the specific yet unpredictable features of space that imbue exceptionality across n number of unknown constituents. Carly Fleischman, a nonverbal autistic self-advocate, professes, in a world of silence, communication is everywhere. You just need to know where to look. Instead of through material precision, the everywhere is proffered through material elaboration, in creating an expanse for capacities of conformability and contortability. The everywhere has the possibility to be shaped in specific, ad hoc, in situ languages for communication. This research implements an architecture that intentionally lacks prescription, paradoxically acts with a material meticulousness that eagerly awaits assignment and desires other agencies to impose their agenda. It wants to give an autonomy, a tinkerability, control over one's own ability to disclose their own sense of ability. My daughter Ada, good timing. My daughter Ada has one set of keys to her worldview, and it's only by her permission and by her actions should it be unlocked and become a welcomed expression of her nonconformity. And we're always asking if architecture can do that. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sean, for the wonderful presentation. I think since you're done, we'll wrap up and start the discussion. So I have to say there's so much overlaps between all of this work, from the programming of materials and the design of material specificity, bio-inspired design, and as well as how our bodies, our cultures, the way we perceive are connected to soft materials. And of course, this is only the cusp of research in this field. There's so much more that could be discussed. But I'd like to bring Philip Beasley into the discussion, since he is here to help moderate, and his work also highly addresses softness in some of the fuzziness of the work and in the instability of the work and the responsiveness of his designs, as well as even the sort of textile work that he has done with Iris van Herpen in fashion design. So Philip, please start by giving us some of your thoughts on what you've seen today and ask some questions to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Virginia. And colleagues, it's just such an incredibly moving experience to be able to be with you. These presentations seem so very, very important in the world today. Not to speak of you being my heroes, which you are. But when I look at the particular language that you are fostering and building, and the kind of questions that you're asking, it's impossibly not to be incredibly moved and motivated into action, because I see you collectively in this gathering as offering a kind of deeply fertile clay to allow a new res publica to emerge. That is the sense of moving architecture into a state where it can truly be fertile. What I'd like to do is just make a couple of comments. I hope you don't mind if I take a couple of minutes for this. In setting up the question I want to ask you is whether we could dwell in softness. That is that rather delicious term that Virginia and colleagues have framed here, and ask whether it qualifies as a paradigm for architecture. It seems rather generic to me and not completely satisfying. And so I want to ask if you could help contribute some more precise language, perhaps to help foster the kind of anatomies or topologies or qualia or reward systems. Perhaps if we speak about some automated intelligence generating this as well, in order to call into question some older paradigms. When I look at the work that's been presented, it strikes me that the kind of intermediate qualities that have been offered in each of these sets of studies and projects offer something very different than Plato's idea in the Timaeus that it boils down to the essential, to the pure circumscription of making a boundary where clarity is essential. And so we distill and distill and distill into something more essential. And it seems like it would certainly be a different line of development than Vitruvius, where everything starts from the firmament and then moves into use, and then eventually gets to beauty as a kind of a lovely elaboration, but at the surface. I mean, the linear quality of the Vitruvian paradigm seems notable, and we might admire Semper's revision of those qualities in the Industrial Revolution in his fourfold of the earthwork and then the structure and then the skin and perhaps textile covering and then the hearth as being a kind of enlightenment. And yet again, it seems to me that there's such an extraordinary linearity to the narrative, even of Semper's definitions, that it seems to say that in the beginning is the structure, and then there is the life. In the beginning, there is the line and the frame, and then we can get to work, and then it can somehow come alive. I wonder if that is necessary, and I wonder if somehow the kind of extraordinary provocation that I heard, Sean, you give with the dandelion and orchid models as being so extraordinarily formative might give rise to some new language. When I was thinking of Mette and Yuliya's work, I saw the lovely vaulted forms, and I saw those tendon structures as well as this stretching material, and it made me wonder which one would come first. Need we think that the vaults come before the epidermis? Or might it be the other way around? Or might it be a continual flux between the two, making it absurd to say which one comes first, the thickening structure or else the stretching between? That made me wonder about Jane's extraordinary work as well, in terms of these being the mycelium being a kind of an extraordinary geotextile that is here's the scaffold, and then it is knit together, and it is rendered whole. And yet, might the topology of that work somehow be so tuned that for a fiber to hop from place to place to place to place is somehow critical, somehow sets up a vibration between the granularity, so that then it starts to harmonize itself. It made me very curious about critical scale in the scaffold, and then how the infill might work. Felecia, I was absolutely struck by how you were making work fundamentally social as well as individual. I was particularly struck by the antenna, which was with this great gathering space, and it reminded me of something perhaps like Wilhelm Reich's or orgone boxes or other extraordinarily charged environments that would on one hand might be healing but somehow became social as well. This made me really wonder whether the work needed to be private or the degrees to which it could be public, and that is in the way these works work. And of course the essay is proposing that it's public, but it reminded me of, say, the collective meditations of the 1960s, in which tents and domes would be so extraordinarily social for us. And it made me think as well of the tragedy of the Munich Olympics, where Frei Otto's extraordinary tented, vast social structures were overridden by the terrorist attacks. And what we might feel and think, what we might have achieved in architecture, had that kind of intermediate compliant work been allowed to speak in a more optimistic tone rather than in the tragedy of the politics that followed. Jenny, that comment applies to your work as well, in the sense of the increasing precision and extraordinary public scales of what you've been achieving. And I find myself again thinking about which came first. Did the integrity stays come first, or the ECM itself as a kind of a pluripotency then coalescing into the structures, but not necessarily being preordained by the scaffolding itself. It was a tremendously tantalizing quality of the public scale of the work. And that returns me then to Sean's work in the capacity of this work to communicate and to offer this extraordinary diversity of material in the analogy of the dandelion and the orchid, and the tinkerability of the work. So I just made some comments which are tumbling out, and I apologize for them not being extremely sorted. What they, I think, revolve around is the question of the extraordinary transitional nature of the materials that are being framed here, their capacity to be public, and whether soft constitutes a kind of paradigm that might stand against the linearity of preceding Western paradigms, like the ones I've complained about, Plato, Vitruvius, and Sempertu, and whether this speaks of genuinely of some new paradigms for architecture. And if that is a promising thought, then my question is one of language, perhaps, of how might we express those paradigms more precisely.
Anyone can feel free to answer that. I for sure feel like that was the premise of a lot of this panel, was to kind of reject or react against that linear thinking of the structure coming first, and really thinking about maybe the people or the material first, or the tactility. I don't know if any of the speakers have thoughts on that as well in their process of working.
I'll venture in here. Thank you, Philip, for trying to daisy chain us together and to find our sort of center. I think this discussion of the soft, I think you're right that it's placeholding a lot of more nuanced thinking, and as shown also in your reader, in the discussions of digital trajectories, you remind us of Negroponte's work on soft computing, and so we know this as a much larger discourse in our field, or quite specifically our field, and it is a term that swims around, that allows us to articulate many different things that are maybe not so maybe it slips in our mind as we speak about it. I think It's a little bit if you want to name the animals. No? God names the animals, and then the animals became tame. Maybe it's quite nice that there is something that we allow it to somehow keep on having this more ephemeral form, but it keeps growing in our mind. I thought Jane's work was really lovely to see, next steps and so on. And I was thinking, Aurélie and I are collaborating a project, Aurélie Moussi, many of us know very well, are working together on these bioluminescent bacteria and trying to find out how to make these micro architectures that are 3D printed in hydrogels, and then figuring out how to combine the knowledge of how to steer and understand building with, or steer and understand a living system, and then also this quite straightforward material fabrication, a design to fabrication system, which is the 3D extrusion of it. And there we have also looked at these textile substrates, and it made me remember, are they called Biotica? Do you remember the victimless leather project they did about 10 years ago? I always thought it was a dress for a mouse. Aurélie corrected me and told me it's a dress of a mouse, but it could also be a dress for a mouse, as it is exactly mouse size. But there is something about that I think I would not have said 10 years ago is about the soft architecture. I would not have sort of joined those thoughts together, although they might have been co-present on our sort of collective stage, but which now again, I feel that there are new intersections emerging that are bringing back to me the sort of Matilda McQuaid extreme textiles sort of really revolutionary moment when she made this exhibition and told us about a completely different way of constructing and thinking very sort of engineering like about materials. And then these sort of much more, I don't know, wet practices that we are trying to absorb. And so what I'm trying to journey towards here is to say that maybe this plasticity of the term of softness also allows us to incorporate and extend the scope of how we are working with materials. And Jane, your presentation is really excellent for that, no? Because you come out of a PhD, which was pretty straightforwardly about fibers and knit systems and performances, but now is entering a much broader language of what these performances can do. And I don't know if it's just an excuse to want to not define, but maybe this openness and porousness of the term allows it to continuously grow.
I'd just like to say, just to follow up on what you're saying, Mette, that I find the potential of softness, of the potential of having this kind of moment to think about softness as a paradigm is really important, and that it's coming at a time where I think it can happen, because people are really re-questioning the kind of global order and how we sit as humans with other species. And so I think the work that Jane is showing with the biology really starts to also open it up to ways in which we think about materials in relationship to our kind of existence on the world, making a kind of better and safer, more sustainable planet. So I find that the moment that we're in allows for a kind of potential for a very rich thought. And I don't know if that could be said, say, like 10 years ago, for example. So I think that many of the events that have happened are making this kind of ability for architecture and as architects and designers and scientists to have the opportunity to restructure the work that we're doing and to really start relooking at things.
Yeah, for sure. That I think that open-endedness of what soft can be is really part of it. And also, like you're saying, that how we think about the world is so different. And even I feel like Sean, your work has changed so much because of a personal relationship with your daughter, but also like before that, you would have never have thought in this vein. So even how different we perceive, like autism has become so much more recognizable and brought to the attention of people these days, and how we perceive the environments. And so it's really important that your work does this.
Let me make a bit more of a provocation on the word softness, because Mette, you've suggested in a lovely provocation that if we name the animals, we will tame them, and so I hardly think that our project is one of anthropocentrism. So with that kind of caution, I wonder whether could expand the word out a little. It seems so very helpful to start with the psyche. Sean, your work seemed like an essay in a transitional object or a transitional field, thinking of the extraordinary psychologist of the child, emerging child psyche, Donald Winnicott, in his study of how soft, sometimes grotesque, sometimes monstrous loveys and dipes and things that we hold before we have names, and just in the weeks after we've been born, are so absolutely extraordinarily important as somehow theaters and scaffolds for our emerging being. And it made me wonder about some physical things. I've been reading about Gerald Pollack's work on the fourth phase of water, in which the ionic state of structured water in the colloidal state seems to have an extraordinary importance that qualifies it actually as a fourth phase, as an explicit quality. And that reminds me of Graham Cairns Smith's lovely work in genetic takeover and in the study of the mineral emergence of life too, in clays. That is to say, a clay in the way it works has an extraordinarily significant kind of transitional quality. When we think of the way cornstarch sets up as well, maybe that's a kitchen sink example of the same thing. And all of the world of gelatins. It would be very, very tempting to look at this whole world as somehow inhabiting something equivalent to the uncanny valley, which is, in computational terms, undesirable. Like we somehow have to get through it in order to clean it up. So it needs to either be clean or else wet. But the difference in between is very difficult. And so perhaps having those intermediate physical states of gelatins and colloids, and perhaps that structured notion of water as well is helpful. And it turns into architecture, I think, perhaps in language of the matrix and scaffold, which is perhaps a rather happy remembrance of 1961 at Otterlo, when CM finally broke apart, but with such incredibly rich language happening between 56 and 61, with Van Eyck's twin phenomenon, for example, or with Joseph Candilas Woods' tartans, the drawing on extraordinary fabric analogies, the Smiths and mat building work as well, and really trying to look at matrix and scaffold and granularity with an extraordinary fertility. anyway, I'm again improvising in searching for language, which is kind of rather despairing about softness itself, because it seems like soft is so oppositional. Okay, it's because we don't want to be hard that we want to be soft, and so it feels like we're drawn into the same kind of dreadful dualism that actually is our nemesis. And so I'm somehow asking, what are the qualities that allow us to stay right at that precarity, which allows us to hover and oscillate between phases rather than being bound to be polarized into the resolution of phasing itself. So I just tried to jump from healing immersions of the psyche, and I jumped into some colonial architecture in Team 10. Forgive me.
Right. Which I don't know that I can make a seamless connection between the two, but I mean, I guess just in trying to respond to some of those thoughts, I find the challenge is really, you know, as an architect, as someone who does want to enjoy the kind of like underpinnings of the work and does want to, you know, as somebody who studied in Germany and wants to be as literate and precise as possible with the words being used about the work. What I find the challenge is really, you know, observing what's happening in front of us. So not just the kind of, you know, mentality that helps drive the work, or the trying to draw conclusions of what's happening. It's really an ability to describe what's happening. Whether that, you know, has to do with softness or whatever, I'm not exactly sure. But I mean, I can speak of it in terms of, you know, my parenting with my daughter. The one thing that we had to lose was our intuition of thinking that we can draw conclusions from one example and one experience and one learning to other conditions and other experiences and other learnings. The only thing we can do is try to gather observations based on each instance and try to, you know, build a catalog, try to build the dictionary from a completely blank set of pages. Like, we're not trying to understand another language, we're trying to build a language. And we can only do that through observation. So figuring out how to, you know, articulate these observations and how to prevent that kind of like presupposition or imagination of, okay, next time now I think it's going to happen like this. Those kinds of things always end up putting us in a bad place, both experientially as a parent, but also, you know, I think in practice as well. So so it's, yeah, I mean, I think that would be the one way to talk about it. And especially, I think what underlies all of this, and certainly speaks to the diversity of the work, is there is no, like, if you want to speak back to the materiality, there is no materiality there until you make the material. So this idea that, like, you know, each of us is making very different materials, very, very different materials. You can put us all in the same room, but in terms of understanding the materiality of one project as a translation to understand the materiality of another project, that's where you're going to put these kind of like ill-conceived notions projected onto something that doesn't fit. So that kind of like premise of you have no foundation, I think is quite what I call it exciting, but incredibly daunting. But opens up, you know, but it opens up that inability to put specific words on it that allow, you know, the cross connection between these diversity of projects. And maybe that's where you end up with soft, because like it's either a huge list of words or it's just one very general one.
Maybe I'll jump in. Thank you, Philip, for your questions and provocations. I mean, it strikes me that in all of our work, the textile is about communication, right? I mean, Felecia, you talk about entanglements. Sean, you speak about the relationships that knitting provides as a dynamic surface for the exchange of a new type of language, which produces new knowledge. And related to that, in all of our work, we're also engaged in collaboration across disciplines, which I think is really important in sort of defining or opening up this question of what softness is. You know, that we're engaged in transdisciplinary work that is not just about solving problems, but opening new problems. You know, problem generation over a kind of determined set of processes, and that to me seems like a very important and current paradigm that we need to be working within. And I agree with you, Felecia, that I don't think we would be there 10 years ago, right? I mean, for me, the focus on the extracellular matrix as an analog is a kind of deep area of inquiry with colleagues in biology, has everything to do with what you brought up, Philip, in terms of, you know, do we talk about the scaffold or the structure? Do we talk about the tissue and the kind of the softness? And it's that reciprocity, right? That the cells literally lay down their own extracellular matrix. You know, we could sort of analogically talk about them as their own sort of looms. So they lay down that ECM and then they communicate within that dynamic protein network, which then specifies form, function, history, program, event, interactivity. And that notion of space and architecture as something that is a communicative landscape that is constantly evolving, right? That there's programming code, but that is always acted upon by external events, you know, and the textile as an interface provides that opening, right? That kind of area of interrogation that maybe starts to touch upon what you're describing, Philip, as the kind of metastable oscillating moment that is, you know, never quite fixed. And the work that we're engaged in terms of transdisciplinary collaboration is also about that sense of individuation, right? That we as designers and as collaborators are constantly evolving, right? And that the knowledge production is not singularly authored. It's about this kind of network of participation. And I do think the softness is really about that kind of undulating exchange of information and establishing relationships and so on. So I just wanted to touch upon what I think are some common threads, as it were, between all of our work and addressing the role of collaboration as a kind of opening for this new type of paradigm.
Sorry.
I just wanted to add a bit of my thought before it goes way off to another discussion. The answer to Philip's comment about the softness and the physical. So which I find very interesting is that softness is a relative term, because how do you measure, how do you describe it, and how do you actually understand what's soft? Of course, you can do some kind of physiological measurements, but you understand when something is soft being compared to something that's hard next to it, and which is nice that we, working with knit, can control this level of softness, as well as we are trying to engage working with fabrics that work not only fabrics itself, but with the other materials that integrated in it. So yeah, So it's interesting to see how this term actually is floating depending on what you compare it to. For example, the tension fabric, it's not soft, it's hard, which is actually quite striking to see some soft floppy fabric that would lay on the floor, but all of a sudden it works structurally and holds the things. So I would say that fabric is not secondary, it actually can be quite active in participating in structure forming.
Yeah, I think that's very true, that that softness doesn't have to also mean physically soft, right? Some things can be visually soft, emotionally soft. It doesn't really have to be about that tactility, because it could be perceived as soft and actually resultantly be hard. I think also there was one comment in YouTube from Lemma that softness also does have a lot of connotations to gender, which is quite interesting. And that is definitely one of the things of even who's working with softness here. Our panel is mostly female, but also there's like cultural connotations of females being soft, being gentle, being sensitive, or these types of things. And I wonder how those relationships can appear in an architectural realm, as we also see this kind of shift of female architects needing more presence within the field, and also more representation within the built environment.
I'd like to backtrack on the sphere of naming the. I mean, I think maybe the point of talking about plastic terms is not about not being precise, and not about not holding on to a sort of intellectual inquisity to be able to articulate. I think, of course, we are all involved in that. I just think that there are terms, and I remember seeing this wonderful keynote, which was about sort of hot topics. I can't remember the name for it, but and how they are moving. So how big terms like AI, like VR, mixed reality, how these terms are actually changing all the time, and what we project into them is changing. And maybe what I sort of call for is not imprecision or not a desire to articulate, but more sort of a recognition of the ability to evolve, as you were saying, Jenny. You know? And there, I think there's just this sort of frontier of the biological and the wet. So the new connection to the wet, I think, is really interesting. And I was pinging Virginia during the chats here about this text that the text I referenced also in the talk, which I think is from 2009. I just checked, and where I, in my work, connect the term soft to the pliable, the motile, and the behaving. So this was very much what I thought was most important about softness 10 years ago. And I think now there might be other sort of agendas that are emerging. And I think what you were talking about, Philip, is that can we talk about boundary making in architecture? Can we think about representational methods by which we can understand boundaries, not as sort of inside outside, or here I delineate a correlation between one condition and another condition, these binary things, but can we think of it much more osmotically? And what does there's a perforous membrane allow us to consider? And here, absolutely not literal, because of course here we are with all this net and it's all perforous and it's light streaming through and there are holes all over the place, but not that literalness, but rather that to consider ourselves in a condition of transition, and how do we challenge our sort of Cartesian backdrop with these kinds of other ways of conditioning space. And of course, Philip, you are our our leading star in articulating these kinds of conditions in our field. And with the LASK, Living Architecture Systems Group, you are doing a huge amount of work to try to pioneer how we can consider these new kinds of boundaries. And I think what would be interesting is to maybe, as what you're saying, Sean, be able to try to reconfigure the idea of softness, that maybe make our own little history of terminology to actually lead us from Negroponte and to this new boundary finding situation that we are now confronted with, all of us that are looking at different systems of thinking of a biological living bio-based materiality.
I mean, building right off of that, I would say, I think also trying not to get lost in the trap of like, it is just about our work as making materials. Because obviously there are other much more human-oriented themes that are, you know, found to be best addressed through the textile, through softness, you know, through a material condition, through an environmental condition. But at the same time, I think, you know, our articulation of that motivation, and like I was saying, kind of articulation in the sense of being able to capture observation of that, capture the same level of intricacy in that kind of like human engagement that is spurred through these types of architectures, as well as we can do it with the materiality. Can we do that as well in trying to, you know, capture some of the unique behavior? And for me, I mean, it's can architecture and gender create individual creativity? And I think, you know, the textile is really a good medium to explore that, because of its just, you know, weird space in which we're putting it, that it's not clothing, it's also not architecture, it's also not sewing, it's also not garment making, you know. So I think we have this really unique engine to spur creativity, and then to be able to capture what kind of human creativity, what kind of equalization that gives across a community, across a, you know, a group of individuals in a social setting. I'd love to, you know, have that 2-hour-long conversation about that, which isn't in the weeds of, you know, talking about knitting and fibers and that kind of part of the work as well.
Maybe related to that, just to go back to your comment, Virginia, on the topic of gender, I think we have to be really careful in, you know, essentializing male, female associations with the textile, right? Otherwise, we, I think, sort of slip back into tropes that, I mean, even though I deeply admire the work of cyberfeminist Sadie Plant, you know, where she associates women's work and the role of women in the context of scientific computing through the metaphor of weaving and the textile, right? And instead, I might offer, you know, considering the contribution by Donna Haraway, right, and her analog, not metaphor, but analog of the cyborg, right, where she begins to kind of open up the possibilities for relationships between machines, the body, biology, right, as a hybrid. And so the textile becomes a kind of ground for reciprocity that engages that pattern making, that social pattern making, where gender on a meta level is not binary, right? So I just think we need to be careful of those associations that, you know, because were female and working in textiles. That, you know, is that a thing? Just as a kind of provocation.
No, I definitely agree that that it's not necessarily about the working in it, but also there is long history for sure. But as well, I was thinking more in the general term of softness as well, right? The sort of women have been perceived as being soft and delicate and things like this. And it's not always the best perception. It's not always the correct perception either. But it's something that we have in our culture that we can build upon and change as well.
I like the idea very much of us getting together and making a language that's kind of focused around softness to really talk about and think through some of these issues, because I think they are very deeply seated, and you know, words are very much like a gigantic center of a spider web connected to everything else. And so it would be wonderful to have the opportunity to make the traceries, to look at traveling up some of the webs, the pieces of the web that connect these together. So anyway, I think in terms of your question about softness, would love to do that and to kind of break it down and to see it in all its multiplicities.
Well, I should say that this has been an extraordinarily moving occasion. Felecia, I think you're offering a really valuable opportunity and suggestion to meditate more together. And I very much hope that can occur, because I see this gathering of projects as making a really very substantial contribution to both materially and conceptually and spiritually to the possibility of public architecture that can make fundamental, fertile, renewing contributions to our world. When you were just remarking on that, Felecia, I found myself thinking about the habit of imagining that architecture's emplacement starts with the mundus. That is, with the cut into the earth, the push down, the claim of territory, and how elusive it is to stay at the limen, the gateway, to continue with the Latin terms of mundus and limen, which can be so fundamentally a situation for architecture to contribute. The gateway which crosses continually between the outside and the inside, and the space of the liminal, therefore, as a place which can be every bit, if not more, formative than the mundus and the umbilicus and the central point. And perhaps rather than attacking Plato, as my remarks were predicated on, a kinder reading of his Cora would allow us to see that it's not simply a matter of making things transcendental constantly and yearning for the word that Mette was cautioning us about, but rather a continual kind of flux between action and conception, and action and conception. That is to say, a kind of oscillation, which is what defines life. So perhaps that limen the tectonic of the limen seems to me to invite the veil and the textile and fabric as kind of fundamental architectonics. And so perhaps that could be a motivation for us to continue working together.
I'd also really like to thank Virginia for bringing us here. It's really wonderful to be together. I'm impressed that we are such a small group and that we are so formal with each other. We all know each other so well, but it is nice. It's a wonderful invitation, Virginia. It's a very luxurious thing to take time to have a dialogue, and I think it would be really nice if we can think about what it can produce. And I've been texting Philip if maybe his living architecture systems group 2 maybe should house this discussion. It would be wonderful. No? Yeah, inshallah. But still, I think it would be a good home for a discussion like this, and maybe also to keep provoking each other to just to face, or to, I don't know, how to be together in a space and to discuss our ideas. It'd be very nice.
Yes, thank you so much. I have to say it was such a pleasure to have all of you and on this panel and see all these different approaches to working, and obviously our perception of softness and what that really means is different and the same all at once. Hopefully we can continue to work on these discussions and keep them open. As we conclude, I do also want to mention that our summer event is coming up, and we will be gathering workshops, a doctoral consortium, and our international conference for robotic fabrication will be this summer. Hopefully I will be teaching a workshop with Yiga Liu at Southeast University in China. So it will be probably soft oriented in some way. So I would like to just bring in last thoughts from everyone before we say goodbye. Jane, do you have any last thoughts?
Firstly, just to echo everybody, to say thank you so much for putting this together. It's been such an inspiring event. I've really enjoyed it. And I think thinking about softness and thinking about, and also reflecting on the work that kind of is that I've seen this afternoon, I think there's this really interesting relationship between the precision, this incredible high precision in everybody's practice, and also this area of uncertainty. And that maybe somewhere between precision and uncertainty is where this whole field could develop further.
Yeah, I completely agree, Jane. Thank you, Virginia, for organizing this. It's just really a pleasure to have this discussion with such dear colleagues. A discussion that I think has been evolving between all of us in many ways over a decade long in various formats. And I think part of the I don't want to say difficulty, but the kind of complexity of broaching the topic of softness and attempting to define what it is precisely about what you just said, Jane, that there's this kind of oscillation between the precision and the rigor and the science and the kind of technical mastery of the work and the emergent, generative, uncertain openings that it continually offers, right? And at the same time, kind of provokes looking at materiality as something that's co-produced, right? That it's about the material itself and its responsivity, but also human engagement, as a kind of dynamic set of conditions. So I too just want to echo, I look forward to continuing this conversation in other formats, and it's really great to see all of your current work. Amazing.
Felecia, do you have last thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just keep it brief, but I'm looking forward to continuing or constructing a kind of spider web of thinkings, words, stuff, projects, I don't know, we'll just leave it at ... with you all in the future. So thank you very much for today, Virginia and Philip, for your questions.
All right. Sean, do you have last thoughts?
I'll just comment on on Mette's comment, which it would have been great if you mentioned that earlier, but yeah, the fact that we're actually all very good friends and easy talking with each other, somehow this ended up in a very kind of formal exchange where I think, yeah, kind of a more lively personal conversation would have been fun too. So I hope we have that chance in the not too distant future to do something like that. It would be great.
Wonderful, thank you. I really appreciate all of you attending, and thank you so much, Philip, again, for helping moderate the discussion. Do you have any last thoughts, Philip, as we say goodbye?
Only ones of gratitude. Thank you so very, very much for your extraordinary work. It's incredibly motivating. It makes me want to do some strong, good work of my own, building on this remarkably beautiful, sensitive material that you've shared. Let's do some writing together. Let's publish together. Let's do some workshopping together. Let's work together. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Have a good evening, afternoon, morning, whatever time of day it is where you are.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Virginia.
Bye. Bye, dear colleagues. Thank you.